to. I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to confirm, as been said in earlier contributions from the Labor Party and mentioned in the Select Committee report, that the Labor Party is in favour of this legislation. We think it is a very good advance in world affairs that China is leading, using some of its financial wherewithal, which is very substantial these days, to improve the lot of people in countries that aren't quite as fortunate by funding through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank things that would not otherwise occur. Mr Speaker, I want to mention one level of detail where we don't agree with the government before coming back to our agreement with the general provisions that we're enacting. Mr Speaker, under this agreement, New Zealand subscribes for 4,615 shares in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's given effect to in the Articles of Association of this new organisation, which are included as a schedule to the Act. For every one of those shares, New Zealand commits $1 million of capital to the fund. Not all of it has to be paid across, but we're liable for it to be called if things went wrong, and we agree for a certain proportion of it to be paid in cash. So every time New Zealand's shareholding goes up or down in one of these organisations in the future, there is a considerable economic cost to the country. Or in the case, and this is true of every one of these international finance agreements. Now, I think it was last year, we changed the proportions held by New Zealand in the IMF, and also increased the amount that was due in respect of each IMF member per share. So the effect of that in respect of the IMF was to increase the total amount of capital available through the IMF and the various things that the IMF does, but to decrease the proportion of New Zealand of that increased total. Now, these things only happen occasionally, but when they happen, relatively small changes in shareholding have a big impact on the amount of money that the government is required under the international agreement that is changed to commit to that organisation. And the Labor Party is of the view that those sorts of changes, which are spending taxpayers' money in a way that's not generally contemplated in a budget, those sorts of things should be overseen by the Parliament rather than be done by the Executive. And Mr Speaker, as a consequence in respect of that last amendment to the International Finance Agreements Act, the government conferred upon itself the regulation-making power to agree to changes in the amounts of capital New Zealand is required to be responsible for in these international organisations by statutory regulation. And I thought at the time that that was wrong, that sort of change to international financial agreements ought to have the approval of Parliament. It actually doesn't happen that often. I think the number of times that it would have been before Parliament since the IMF example, and in respect of the IMF, it had only been on a few occasions since the IMF had been founded all those years ago. And in respect of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I'm also confident that those changes in capital subscription won't occur very often. And one of the reasons you can be confident in that is partly they've got so much room to move, and that the capital subscribed for is so much less, so much more than the capital that is called. And so if there is a need for some more capital in the fund, they've got quite a bit of room to move in terms of calling capital that's already been subscribed upon, rather than increasing the capital that is subscribed for and therefore the total liability of the government. So, Mr Speaker, I think it's wrong that through this amendment legislation we're actually extending the right of the Executive to change the obligation of a future New Zealand in the future by way of statutory regulation, rather than having to come back to Parliament for a new authorisation if they want to subscribe for more capital to one of these international organisations. Mr. Speaker, that said, I want to agree with the Minister of Finance, the Honourable Bill English, in respect of a number of his comments. I think it's very good that New Zealand embraced the concept of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank early on. There is a long history in New Zealand of New Zealand engaging with China, both economically and politically, in advance of a lot of other countries. And I think it's been of credit to New Zealand that we've done that. I think it's also been to New Zealand's benefit of our international reputation, and I think it's also been to our economic benefit. I think it's also benefited China. China, as a consequence of their exposure to New Zealand earlier than would have otherwise been the case, changed its system, I'm sure, in some ways to reflect the sorts of things that New Zealand advocated they should do. And I'm sure just as China gives us advice at times, and we look to them sometimes for examples of where they might do things well, they also look to New Zealand and respect the advice that we tender at times. And that is certainly true in respect of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and through the former Secretary for the Treasury, John Whitehead, the New Zealand government was able to influence the shape of the provisions under which this new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank will operate. One of the concerns that was mentioned in the media by some of the countries that were less enamoured initially of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank were based on the concern that this might be used as primarily a political tool driven by the Chinese government to pursue their international ambitions in a way that wasn't neutral and was pursuing political objectives rather than being focused on what are the most pressing infrastructure needs in this region that need to be met. And I think it's fair to say that those criticisms have waned as a consequence of the fact that when the detail has been provided as to how the Asian Infrastructure Investment Board will act, those concerns have waned, and there's now widespread recognition across not just the countries that are in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but across other developed countries as well, that the earlier concerns were not valid. And I think that reflects well upon both China and New Zealand. And those operating principles, sir, are set out in Article 3, and it says the operating principles are firstly that the bank is guided by sound banking principles in its operations. Secondly, that the operations of the bank will provide principally for the financing of specific projects or specific investment programs. There's some more detail which I won't read out there. It shall not finance any undertaking in the territory of a member if that member objects to such financing, so they've got to have the cooperation of the local government. The bank will ensure that each of its operations complies with the bank's operation and financial policies, including without limitation policies addressing environmental and social impacts. It's pleasing to see that. There were some earlier projects of the IMF and other development projects elsewhere in the world where there was the assertion that some of the projects that were funded by international banks like the IMF, that they inappropriately ignored some of the adverse environmental consequences, and indeed my understanding is that some of the projects that were criticised were mining projects, or actually not so much mining projects as some big power projects, including hydro projects in parts of the world that had serious environmental concerns, including the displacement of local people who weren't treated fairly when they were displaced and perhaps shouldn't have been displaced in the first place because the projects might not have been that wise. So it's good to see that that sort of thing has been guarded against through Part 4 of Article 13. Mr. Speaker, there are other parts of this agreement which will ensure that New Zealand's reputation for pursuing good governance in the world is adhered to. I think that's very important, that New Zealand lends our weight and our ethic, which is that we ought not to be embarking in corrupt practices, and we ought not to be assisting in corrupt practices. And so I'm sure that New Zealand's influence on the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank will ensure that it is less likely that this bank gets tied up in investments, or through those investments in the propping up of corrupt practices in the countries that this Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank will be assisting. So with those comments, I will take my seat and record my thanks to the Minister of Finance for shepherding this through.